a question. What about redshift and blueshift, the pattern in the universe discovered before the Planck missions, etc., that pointed toward the Earth being the center of the universe? Well, I'm sure he is referencing the Hubble.
Yeah. Well, let me just say real quick that the Doppler interpretation of the redshift, which has been sort of standard scientific law for a long time, is something that is very much in question. An American physicist, what was his name? He was
Halton Arp, I think, wasn't it? Halton Arp?
Yeah. He was one of the top experts in
astrophysics.
Quasars, yeah. And he said that there's a great deal of evidence now to the effect that in quasars, for example, the redshift is not a Doppler effect. And so the whole idea of Doppler effect, it was a very convenient way of explaining this shift towards the red side of the spectrum, but it is very much in question, and it would not surprise me at all if, say, 10 years from now, it were a known, accepted scientific fact that there is no redshift at all, no, in the sense of Doppler effect.
Well, it's a very interesting thing. The more I look at this, there are certain problems in astrophysics that are solved beautifully on the assumption that redshift is a distance indicator or a recession indicator. But there are just exactly as Halton Arp pointed out, when you have a physical connection between a quasar that's supposed to be, billion years old, and a galaxy that's supposed to be much younger and much closer, you start wondering. And of course, the simple fact is, as Hubble discovered, when you look out at all of these galaxies, and later on as we got more powerful telescopes, the quasars and so on, we're at the center. I mean, if you assume that it is a velocity indicator, it puts us at the center. And of course, we cover this in the principle, and this was another genius intervention by Uncle Albert himself to say, okay, it looks like we're in the center, but we can't be in the center. I know. Expanding four-dimensional space-time.
This Einsteinian strategy of making everything equal.
Yes, exactly.
Here at Earth, for example, we may see everything receding from us. Well, Albert Einstein says, well, everybody is the same. If you put yourself on the moon or on some remote place in the galaxy, you will have the same thing. And I must say it's very ingenious. If you are living on the surface of an expanding balloon,
that's exactly.
Then wherever you are, your neighbors are going to be moving away from you if it is expanding.
It's brilliant.
So it's brilliant, but
it's ad hoc.
It is ad hoc, and I was really amazed, and I thank Dr. Robert Bennett for making this vast literature somehow accessible to me. I was amazed to see how absolutely non-existent empirical verification of Einsteinian physics is out there. In fact, the fact is there's really nothing out there. I'd like to make one remark because I think perhaps for many viewers this may come as a surprise. One of the most convincing, quote, confirmations of relativity is the famous formula E equals mc squared. And we all know, tragically, that this formula is true and dead accurate. Well, what is the story about that? Einstein derived it from his theory of relativity, special theory, and this is true. You can do that. What he did not tell us is the fact that this formula follows directly from the Maxwell equations, which existed ever since about 1848. And in fact, had been picked up by physicists in the 19th century. I understand there's some obscure journal someplace where this formula has actually been derived. The point is that it has nothing to do with relativity theory. But hardly anyone knew this. I didn't know it. I mean, I was among the duped people who thought that this was confirmation with a bang, a very big bang.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was not until 1950 that Einstein confirmed that in one of his writings. He said, yes, that can be derived from the Maxwell equations. In the meantime, the damage, I would say, was done. The whole world had become Einsteinian.
Well, you know, this raises a very interesting theme that recurs in your work over and over again. The distinction between science and scientism. And this is a very profound part of your work because unlike Guénon, for example, you do not reject the scientific method and you do not reject the fruits of the scientific enterprise, quite to the contrary. On the other hand, you have very short shrift for what you term the mythical encrustations that are added to these scientific facts to become this scientistic myth, if you will.
Well, I would distinguish between scientism and, what shall I say, a word that doesn't sound too cruel. It's deception, and these are two different things. Now, I'm sorry to say that deception has occurred in various scientific domains. It used to be very rare. Now it's sort of the standard thing. And let me give you one example of this, which I think is really astounding. Among the experimental effects which are known to be true, which do contradict Einsteinian relativity, is the Sagnac effect, which was 1913 that was published. You had an interferometer mounted on a rotating platform, and it splits the light into two beams. One goes with the rotation, the other counter to it, and so the one turns out to be superluminal and the other turns out to be subluminal, and this goes against Einstein. Now, you may say this is a non-inertial reference frame, so you are talking general relativity. Well, later, somebody by the name of Wang,
Ruyang
Wang made a beautiful experiment where he did essentially the Sagnac effect, but instead of a rotating platform, he had a platform in rectilinear motion. He compared light beams going with the motion. Same thing as Sagnac. He modestly called it a generalized Sagnac effect. Otherwise, nobody would have published it. And
I must say that I've never met Ruyang Wang, but if I ever got the chance, I would shake his hand and say that is the most brilliantly thought of title.
Diplomatic.
Diplomatic, because essentially it's challenging a fundamental premise of Einsteinian physics. And the word relativity never appears in his paper.
It would have never been published.
It never would have been
published. Because I think most people, even in the skeptical age, would be amazed to realize the amount of deception, actual deception. And I learned about this recently from Dr. Robert Bennett's writings. Let me just recount that briefly. In the so-called GPS or global positioning system, this is really a laboratory ideally suited for testing Einsteinian effects.
Yes.
And the operation of GPS involves microwave beams going from the Earth to a satellite. And it was found that the time of travel depends, and therefore the speed of light, depends on whether the satellite is approaching or receding.
Yeah.
We're talking a 50
nanosecond,
nanosecond change, which happens to be significant. And all the people who work for GPS and are on the inside track know that this 50-second nano
correction,
correction needs to be put in, otherwise planes
yeah.
will crash. And they do it, but officially they are using what is called a
solar
barycentric reference frame. But what they don't tell you is that they program it to coincide with a geocentric reference frame.
This is a fabulous story.
And nobody knows this except the insiders.
And it was because of the insiders that we found out about
yes.
it. It was covered and Galileo was wrong.
So,
this was just amazing because actually Ron Hatch is a very close associate of Ru Young-Wang, and Ron Hatch was in the principal. And Ron was one of the guys working with Ru Young-Wang who discovered that, okay, everybody knows they use the Earth-centered inertial frame for the GPS. Why wouldn't they? They're dealing with the Earth. But they always said, but when on these deep space probes like Voyager, well, then we use the solar system barycentric. Oh, well, gee whiz. It turns out that they then rejiggered the formulas rejiggered to render them Earth-centered inertial. Okay, it's just amazing. There's a whole movie to be made there in itself. Let's go ahead and let me just say, I am certain that the questioner means the Allais effect, Allais, Maurice Allais' experiments with the paraconical pendulum. Are you familiar with them at all?
You know much more about that.
I actually am quite interested in the Allais effect. What this boils down to, this French, I believe he won a Nobel Prize in economics, if I remember correctly. But he was always a physicist. He was an experimentalist, and he conducted amazingly long series of experiments with a paraconical pendulum in eclipses, and was able to document amazing anomalous behavior of a paraconical pendulum in conditions of the eclipses, particularly. I think it's fascinating stuff. I think it ties in with even more fascinating stuff. Simon Scholl's work in Russia, where he has determined actual periodicities and decay rates of atomic particles tied to astrophysical properties. So I'm afraid, folks, this is all the time we have. Dr. Smith has so much on his plate, and thank you so much for giving us this special treat. You guys were great. The questioners were fantastic. And don't forget, Bob Sungenis will be bringing something to the table for the flat earther in your community or your family. I mean, everybody's got one now. So keep an eye open for that. From here at the Principal, we thank you for attending, and God bless you one and all.